The ship was dying, and the stars did not care. They burned the same as always, cold and distant and completely indifferent to the fact that the Krells was leaking atmosphere from 3 separate hull fractures and listing 19 degrees to port and making sounds in its bones that metal was never meant to make. Low grinding structural sounds, the kind that came from a frame bending when it should not bend. Vex had stopped expecting the universe to acknowledge what was happening to them approximately 6 days ago. She sat at the communications console on what remained of the bridge and looked at her screens. Most of them were dark. 3 still worked. They showed her numbers she had memorized on day 2 and had been checking every hour since in the small, irrational hope that the numbers would change. They did not change. 14 survivors out of a crew of 209. She had counted 3 times before she accepted it. The first count gave her 210 dead, which was wrong, so she counted again. The second gave her 28 dead, which was also wrong. The third gave her 29 dead and 14 living. And by then, the other survivors had stopped asking her to recount and had begun the quieter process of accepting what the numbers said. The Kalora had been a beautiful ship. Vex was permitted to think this now, because beauty no longer carried any weight. There was no pressure attached to it, no pride, no career investment, just the clean fact of it, the way you could admire something clearly once you had stopped needing it to be anything. She had served on it for 6 years, 6 years of deep survey, worked through the unmapped regions of the third arm, cataloging gravitational formations and gas density pockets, and occasionally the wreckage of civilizations that had been spacefaring once and were not anymore. Methodical work, precise work, the kind of work that did not require anyone to think carefully about dying. She was thinking very carefully about it now. The air recyclers had 20 hours of primary capacity remaining. After that, reserve mode would activate. Reserve mode would give them approximately 60 hours more, possibly 65 if they kept their physical activity minimal and let the temperature drop below the comfort threshold. The emergency rations would last longer than the air, which was almost funny in a way that was not funny at all. Vex had done this math. She had done it many times. The math did not change, and finishing the calculation produced nothing useful. So she had stopped finishing it. She pressed the transmit button. The motion was automatic by now, as natural as breathing. This is the Krell Collective Survey Vessel, Kelsara Registry Designation, KCS 7714. We are broadcasting on all available emergency frequencies. We have sustained catastrophic structural damage following a hostile engagement. We have 14 survivors. Life support systems are in critical condition. Our current coordinates are that she read the numbers from the screen in a flat, careful voice. The voice she had been using for 9 days. The one that did not crack, because cracking accomplished nothing. We have no propulsion capability and cannot maneuver. If any vessel is receiving this transmission, please respond on any open channel. We will remain on broadcast. She released the button. The silence came back immediately. Total patient. Enormous. It always came back like that. The Varric raiders had hit them on the 9th day of the survey mission. Not from nowhere. Vex was precise by training and nature, and from nowhere was imprecise language for a precise event. They had been tracked. She knew this because she had pulled the passive sensor logs from the 6 days before the attack and found what she was looking for once she knew what to look for. A faint, careful signal. A ship shadow at the edge of detection range, holding a constant distance and never triggering the automated proximity alarm. Patient, deliberate, professional. The attack lasted 11 minutes. She had not counted this intentionally. The number had simply fixed itself in her mind the way numbers sometimes did when they were attached to events large enough to reorder everything that came before and after them. First strike, the engine core. In 4 seconds, the Krellsara became a thing that drifted rather than a thing that flew. Second strike, decks 7 through 12, 103 crew members. Third through 6 strikes, fast enough to feel like one long, terrible moment. The rest of the damage, the rest of the dead. The transformation is complete. Then the raiders had left. No boarding party, no search for survivors, no attempt to take cargo or data cores or prisoners. They had destroyed the Krelsara with the efficiency of something checking a task off a list, and then departed, leaving the wreckage to drift. Vex had spent the first 3 days trying to understand this. The Ver were not known for charity, but they were known for pragmatism, and destroying a survey vessel with no material gain was not pragmatic, which meant either the destruction itself was the point. Someone had paid for the ship to disappear from this region of space, or the attack was a communication, and the message was addressed to someone who had not yet received it. Neither interpretation helped the 14 of them. Commander Joro was alive, which was something. He had been in his pressure suit when the attack began, a coincidence of timing, since his quarters on Deck 9 were now vacuum, and he lay now on a field caught near the rear of the bridge, breathing in the shallow, careful pulls of someone managing pain without adequate medication. His left upper limb had been injured in the initial strike. Engineer Talos had bandaged it. Talos was an engineer and not a medic, and his bandaging reflected this honestly. Jorik had not complained. He was 70 years old, a career officer, a veteran of 4 postings in contested sectors before this one. He had the quality of stillness that Vex associated with people who had already faced every version of bad outcome and made their private peace with all of them. Not resignation, something more like readiness, an acceptance of the full range of possibility that left no room for panic, because panic required surprise, and Joro was no longer surprised by anything. "Any response?" he asked, without opening his eyes. "No, Commander." He nodded once, closed his eyes again. This was the shape of their days. "Vex broadcast?" Jorik asked. The silence answered. Engineer Talos worked in the tangle of exposed conduit that ran along the port wall, his 4 hands moving with the focused economy of someone who had found a problem complicated enough to fully occupy him. Vex did not ask Talos what he was working on anymore. She had asked on day 4, and the answer had been long and technical, and had ended with the words, "which buys us approximately 4 additional hours," said in the same tone you might use to discuss the weather. 4 additional hours. She thanked him. Reth, the communications technician, had not left his cot in 3 days. He had broken 4 limbs in the initial impact, and the secondary infection had spread despite everything Talos had done, which was the best they had, and was not enough. He breathed. He looked at the ceiling. He did not speak much anymore, and when he did, his voice was thin and very far away. Sorve senior analyst slept almost continuously. A cranial pressure issue. Talos had done what he could. Vex checked on both of them every 4 hours precisely because checking on them was the shape of care when you had nothing else to give, and she gave it on schedule. The viewport on the starboard side of the bridge was the only one still intact. Through it, she could see the stars, and periodically a dense, bright cluster about 11 degrees off the bow. The Krelsora had no active stabilization, so the ship drifted in a long, lazy rotation, approximately 1 full turn every 18 hours, and the star cluster swept through the viewport like the hand of a very slow clock. Vex had started using it to mark time. It was better than the clock on the console, which showed hours she had stopped counting. She was watching the cluster complete its 3rd pass of the day when the console beeped. Not the flat automated sound of the distress system running its cycle. Something else, a higher tone, an incoming signal indicator, the kind that only activated when it received something external to trigger it. Her claws still went over the keys. The console beeped again. A second indicator lit up beside the first, the proximity identification register. It had been dark for 9 days because it required another vessel's automated handshake signal to activate. She reached for the scan system with hands that had become very precise and very careful. The way her hands became when she was doing something she absolutely could not do wrong. One contact bearing 273 ranged approximately 7,000 kilometers with a considerable margin of error. A broken scanner introduced a large class 400 memeters in length, perhaps the engine signature. She cross-referenced the signature against the standard database. They are not any of the 16 species in the compact standard registry. She pulled up the extended file, the one for vessels outside the compact trade network, the one she had accessed twice in 6 years because it had almost never been relevant. The query ran. The result came back. She looked at it. She looked at the scan return again, at the distance, at the fact that the ship was simply sitting there, not approaching, not hailing, not doing anything at all except existing 7,000 kilometers off their port side, in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of the past 9 days. That other silence had been the silence of nothing. "This one had to wait, Commander," she said. Her voice came out steady. She noted this distantly as a fact about herself she had not been certain of until it happened. Jeroic was upright before she finished the word. Not fast, his injury prevented fast, but with the controlled precision of someone moving correctly. He settled into the chair beside her and looked at the screen. Distance 7,000 kilometers, bearing 273. He studied the scan return. His face did what it did when he was processing something unexpected. A brief and perfect stillness, like the surface of water just before something large moved beneath it. "Species identification?" he asked. She told him. The word sat in the bridge air down the corridor movement. Other survivors stirred. Word traveled fast on small ships, and it did not need the communication system to do it. Jeroic looked at the viewport for a moment. The star cluster was visible, very bright. He looked at it the way people sometimes looked at a fixed point when they were deciding something. When he spoke, his voice was level. It was always level, but there was something beneath the levelness now that Vex had not heard in 9 days. Not once, not from him. She did not have a precise word for it. "God of the deep water," he said quietly. It was a very old Krell phrase, older than space travel, from the era when the Krell were still ocean floor creatures, and the deep water above them was the most dangerous and most sacred thing their world contained. The phrase means something between "we are in the presence of something vast, and there is nothing left to do but meet it." They did not use it lightly. Vex understood why he had used it now. She had read the files on humans. Every compact officer read the files. Humans had arrived in galactic space approximately 140 years ago, late by any comparative standard. Since most spacefaring civilizations had been traveling between stars for centuries or longer before humans worked out the drive equations, they came with no particular technological advantages. They were physically unremarkable, soft-bodied, single-stomached, dependent on artificial life support in the same ways as everyone else. Their ships were good, but not exceptional. Their resources were adequate, but not vast. What they had was something the files struggled to quantify accurately. The Xenoc psychology reports used phrases like anomalous stress response patterns and non-standard risk calculation under threat conditions. Older literature called it an instinct for violence. The most recent analyses preferred behavioral optimization in high mortality scenarios, which was a more measured way of saying that humans responded to the possibility of death differently than other species did. Not with the calculated retreat that evolutionary history had taught most intelligent creatures, but with something that looked from the outside like acceleration. They had gone to war with the Veth Dominion 30 years ago. The vet had projected a 2-month campaign. It lasted 8. The humans had won. No galactic analyst had entirely predicted that outcome. The USH is relentless. She had pulled the registry file in the second since the identification returned, was listed as a heavy exploration and response vessel. Armed crew complement of approximately 220. Currently deployed in a 3rd armed survey zone, the same zone as the Kelsara. She looked at the ship sitting there in the dark, unmoving 7,000 kilometers away, not approaching, not hailing, just present in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, as though it was waiting for something or making a decision. Vex thought about the dead air recyclers, the math. She had stopped finishing, breathing on his cot, Sorvich sleeping, Yorich breathing carefully through his pain. She thought about the silence of the past 9 days and how it had felt like being slowly forgotten by the universe. She thought about what she knew about humans and what she did not know, and the gap between those two things. Then she pressed the transmit button. Unidentified vessel bearing 273. She said, "This is Vex, communications officer of the Krell Collective Survey Vessel, Krell Sora. We have observed your presence. We have 14 survivors aboard the ship. We are not a threat. We cannot run." She paused, not for effect. The pause was because she genuinely was not certain what to say next, which was not a condition she experienced often. "We are asking for help." She released the button. For 4 seconds, the silence came back. Then the console lit up with an incoming transmission, and a voice came through. A human voice, female, unhurried, with an accent that the translator rendered in flat compact standard, but that carried something underneath the translation. Some texture and weight that software could relay but not fully explain. "Kelsara, this is Captain Sarah Marsh of the USHS Relentless. We read you loud and clear. A brief pause, and then we're coming to you. Sit tight." Just that. No conditions, no questions about the nature of the threat, or the status of the wreckage, or the political implications of a human vessel responding to a Krell distress call in a contested survey zone. No hesitation, no discussion. Just, "We're coming." Vex sat very still with her claw on the console and felt something move through her that was entirely unfamiliar, a sensation she did not have a precise word for in Krell, though the cross-species translation files offered the human approximation. Relief. The human ship began to move. The relentless movement was like it had somewhere to be. Vex watched through the viewport as the human ship crossed the 7,000 kilometers between them. Not rushing, not cautious, just steady and direct. The way a large predator moves when it has already decided and does not need to announce its intentions. It was big, bigger than the scan reading had suggested. Or maybe it was just that distance had softened the numbers, and proximity was now doing the correction work. 412 m, from bow to stern. She could see now angular, not the smooth curves of Krell design philosophy or the layered plating of thy construction. The relentlessness looked like it had been built by people who did not spend a great deal of time asking whether a ship was beautiful. They had asked whether it worked. It worked. Commander Jorik stood beside her at the viewport. He had gotten up from the cot without assistance, which told her more about his current condition than any medical report she could have written. His bandaged limb hung at his side. He watched the human ship approach with an expression that Vex could not read with certainty, which was unusual because she had spent 6 years learning to read Yorik's expressions. Behind them, she could hear the other survivors moving. Quiet voices, the shuffle of careful footsteps in low gravity. 9 days of silence and waiting had reduced their conversation to the necessary minimum, but now there was a different quality to the movement, something that was not quite hope, but was in the direction of it. Vex turned back to her console. The Relentless had matched their drift rotation and was now holding position approximately 400 meters off the port side. She could see the running lights, white, red, a green band along the lower hull edge. She could see through the human ship's viewport the faint internal lighting of what appeared to be a corridor. The communications channel opened. "Krell Sara, we're going to send across a boarding team. Is your port airlock functional?" Vex checked her panel. "Partially functional. It will cycle, but the inner door seal is compromised. We have one emergency pressure barrier behind it." "Good enough," the voice said. "Captain Marsh, we'll work with that. Can you give me a crew status? How many are mobile, and how many need medical transport?" Vex went through the numbers. 9 mobile survivors, 3 mobile with difficulty, 2 requiring stretchers. As she spoke, she became aware of how clinical she sounded, and then aware that clinical was the correct register for this kind of information exchange, and then aware that she had been thinking in several layers simultaneously for 9 days, and was perhaps slightly less composed than she appeared. "Understood," Marsh said. "Dr. Chen is coming across with the first team. She'll sort your critical cases first. Keep everyone where they are and let us come to you." "Understood," Vex said. A pause on the channel, then Marsh again. "You did good keeping them alive this long. 9 days is not nothing." Vex did not know what to say to that. She said, "Thank you, Captain." The channel closed. On the bridge of the Relentless, Captain Sarah Marsh clipped her earpiece and turned back to face her crew. They were watching her. They always watched her the way people watched the sky when they were trying to predict weather. Not with fear exactly, but with a particular kind of attention that was really about reading what was coming and positioning themselves accordingly. She was aware of this. It did not bother her. "Dax," she said. Lieutenant Marcus Dax looked up from his weapons console. He was the kind of person who seemed permanently on the verge of saying something that would be either very funny or very tactless, and had spent most of his career narrowly choosing the first option. "Captain, what are we looking at?" 3 hull breaches, serious structural compromise on the midship section, at least 1 deck that's entirely open to space. Weapons are offline, engines are offline, life support is running on fumes. He looked at his screen, then back at her. Someone did a thorough job on them. Varric's signature. Energy residue matches Varric heavy assault configuration. Yeah, the kind they use when they're not trying to be subtle. He paused. The Calora was a survey ship, Captain, not a combat vessel. Whoever called this in, they wanted that ship gone. Marsh looked at the wreck on the main screen. She had been looking at it since they had first picked up the distress signal 4 hours ago while she was deciding. She was done deciding. She had been done deciding for approximately 3 of those 4 hours. The 4th hour had been spent on the practical questions of approach, docking, and not making a bad situation worse. "Tours," she said. Ina and Lena Tours looked up from navigation. She was 23 years old and had been on the Relentless for 7 months, and still sometimes had the expression of someone who was quietly amazed to be here, which Marsh had decided she would stop finding endearing in approximately another 4 months. "Captain, plot a drift match holding pattern. I want us close enough that a transfer cable across to their port airlock gives us a stable line. No thrusters after that unless I say so. I don't want our exhaust near their hull fractures." "Yes, Captain, Dr. Chenduch." Dr. Yuna Chen was already standing at the bridge entrance with her field kit over one shoulder. She was small and fast and had the quality of someone who had decided long ago that emergencies were her natural habitat. "I heard the status report," she said. "I need 2 medics and a cart. Can someone tell me what Krell physiology looks like before I go over there? I can send you the compact file." "I've already pulled the compact file. It's 14 years out of date and was clearly written by someone who had never actually seen a Krell. I want someone who has. No one on the bridge had." "I'll figure it out," Chen said, already turning. "I usually do." Marsh let her go. She looked at the wreck again. 9 days, 14 survivors. Someone had hit a survey ship, killed 200 people, and just left. And for 9 days, out of all the space between here and the nearest compact relay, the only thing that had answered that distress signal was the Relentless. Because the Relentless had been 4 hours out when the signal finally crossed their detection range. Dax was still looking at his screen. "Vedic raiders in this sector," he said, not quite casually. "You know, they don't usually hit survey vessels unless they're protecting something or being paid to protect something." "I know. Which means whatever the Krella was surveying, somebody wanted them not to survey it. I know that too. And if they come back to check their work, then they'll find us here," she said flatly, no inflection. "Get the weapons systems warm but passive. I don't want an active signature advertising what we're doing. It's already warming." She looked at him. He shrugged. "You had that expression when you were looking at the wreck." "I've learned to read that expression." "What expression?" "The one that says someone is going to have a very bad day, and it's probably not going to be us." Marsh turned back to the main screen. "Let's get those people off that ship first." The boarding team came through the port airlock in a cluster. 6 humans in pressure gear, moving efficiently, carrying equipment that Vex did not recognize. They were shorter than she had expected. The files had given dimensions that she had processed intellectually without turning into a visual image, and the visual image was now adjusting several internal assumptions. They were soft-bodied and upright, and moved with a directness that did not allow much room for hesitation. The one at the front was Dr. Chen. Vex knew this because of the medical kit, and because she came through the airlock, already looking around in the purposeful way of someone whose job begins the moment they arrive. She saw Vex, gave her a single brief nod of acknowledgement and said, "Where are your critical cases?" without any preamble at all. Vex took her to rest first. Dr. Chen crouched beside the cot, opened her kit, and began working. Her hands were quick and small and very certain. She did not ask for an explanation of what she was seeing. She made two quiet sounds, one that seemed to indicate she had identified the problem, and one that seemed to indicate she had a plan, and began pulling equipment from the kit in a specific order. "Infection and blood loss," she said to her own medical staff, rather than to Vex. "Probably a reaction to whatever field dressing was used, not a criticism," she added, glancing briefly at Talos, who had followed them down the corridor. "You kept him alive. That's what mattered. Let me take it from here." Talos looked at Vex. Vex looked at Talos. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and also because watching a human doctor work had taken both of their attention more completely than they had expected. The other humans had dispersed into the ship. Vex was aware of this in the background movement in the corridors. Voices that were not Krell voices speaking quietly to each other. It should have felt like an intrusion. It did not quit because the voices were not urgent in the way of threat. They were urgent in the way of people assessing a problem. She went back to the bridge. Captain Marsh was already there. Vex had not seen her come through the airlock. She had simply arrived the way important things sometimes simply arrived. She was standing at the center of the bridge looking at the damage to the port wall with the expression of someone reading a language they know well but have not heard spoken in a while. She was not tall. That was the first thing Vex registered, because for some reason the files had implied size. She was average by human standards, which meant she came somewhere around Vex's upper thorax. She wore a gray uniform with the rank insignia at the collar, and had short, dark hair, and the kind of face that did not offer much away, unless it chose to. She looked at Vex, and what Vex expected was some version of the reaction species had to each other the first time. The small adjustment period, the beat of strangeness, there was none of that. Marsh looked at her the way she would have looked at any crew member reporting on a damaged ship, directly with the question already forming. "Communications officer," she said. "Yes, Captain, you're Vex. Yes. Walk me through what happened." She said it the way people say things they have said many times. Not as a request, not quite as an order, but as a practical opening of a necessary conversation from the beginning. Everything you observed. Vex walked her through it. The 6 days of being tracked before the attack, the 11 minutes, the decision the raiders had made not to board, the 9 days of silence. She was precise and sequential because that was how she thought and how she spoke, and Marsh listened without interrupting. Which was something Vex noted because people who were deciding things while someone else was talking usually interrupted. Marsh did not. She listened to the whole thing, and at the end, she was quiet for 3 seconds that felt specific rather than empty. Survey coordinates. Marsh said, "What were you surveying when they found you?" Vex told her the region, the specific grid section, the unusual gravitational gradient that had brought them to this part of the third arm, which was officially unmapped and was officially no one's territory. Marsh looked at Commander Jorik, who had been standing to the side, listening with his eyes half closed. "Commander, do you know what's in that grid section?" Joro opened his eyes. "No," he said. "That was why we were there." Marsh nodded slowly. "Someone does." A silence. Lieutenant Dax had come onto the bridge somewhere in the middle of the conversation. Vex had heard him before she saw him, because he made a quiet, involuntary sound when he looked at the damage to the structural beam near the viewport. A sound that mixed assessment with something else. He was looking at the ceiling now, with the expression of a person doing mental arithmetic they did not entirely enjoy. "The power couplings on this deck are going to fail in about 3 hours. He said to know one specific, maybe 4, if the engineer he looked at in Talos is as good as I think he is based on the fact that anything is still running at all." Talos straightened slightly. "High praise," Vex told him very quietly. "I assumed," Talos said. Marsh turned to Dax. Can we stabilize them long enough for a full transfer if we run a power line across from our hull? Yes. 6 hours of stability. More if we push capacity. He glanced at the damaged console bank on the far wall. Some of this we can't fix with what we have. The structural stuff especially. This ship is not flying again. Marsh said not flying again. Dax confirmed. Vex had known this. She had known it since day 2 when Talos had given her the full engineering assessment, and she had read it twice and then put it where she kept information that was true and also not immediately useful. But hearing it said out loud by someone who had walked through the ship for all of 10 minutes and reached the same conclusion with such certainty was a different kind of knowing. Commander Jorik heard it too. He did not react visibly. He was too experienced for visible reactions to things he had already calculated. But Vex, who had been watching him for 6 years, saw him take one slow breath and then let it go. "How long will the transfer take?" Vex asked Marsh. "For 14 people and whatever personal materials your commander deems essential. 4 hours if we move efficiently." She looked at Vex. "Does that work for you?" It was a strange question. Vex turned it over briefly, because in theory the answer was obvious. 4 hours was within their air recycler window. They had limited alternatives. The answer was yes. By every rational measure, Marsh had asked it as though Vex's assessment genuinely mattered in the logistics calculation. "Yes," Vex said. "That works." "Good." Marsh turned to Dax. "Get the power line across. I want this ship to be stable while we work." Dax was already heading for the airlock. Marsh paused at the viewport, looking out at the stars and the wreckage of the exterior hull sections visible from this angle. She looked at them the way she had looked at everything since arriving on the bridge, not with horror, not with pity, with something more like a clean and direct anger, the kind that did not shout. 9 days, she said to no one in particular. "Yes," Vex said. 9 days and no one else came. It was not a question. Vex answered it anyway. "No, Captain. No one else came." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said, "we're here now." She turned from the viewport and began issuing instructions into her earpiece, and the work of pulling 14 people out of a dying ship began. The humans worked like they were running out of time, even when they were not. Vex had read enough cross-species behavioral literature to know that this was a documented pattern, not a personal quirk of this particular crew. Humans operated at a base level of urgency that other species reserved for emergencies. They moved fast. They talked fast. They made decisions the way people threw things when they were running, not carelessly, but without the pause that other species used to check if the throw was optimal. She stood near the communications console and watched them move through the Krell Sara and tried to file observations in an orderly way, which was difficult because there were 6 of them and they were rarely standing still. The power line had come across from the Relentless within 20 minutes of Marsh giving the order. An engineer named Kowalski had run it personally, moving along the transfer cable between the 2 ships in a pressure suit, with the calm focus of someone who had done this before in conditions that were probably worse. He had connected it to Kelsura's secondary junction, and the lights on the bridge had gone from dim and flickering to steady, and Talos had made a sound that Vex had never heard from him before. A short exhale, almost involuntary, the sound of someone putting down a weight they had been carrying for 9 days. She understood it exactly. Dr. Chen had moved from Reth to Sorv to the other 2 seriously injured crew members with the systematic speed of someone working a checklist they had internalized so thoroughly. It was no longer a checklist, but just thinking. She had 2 medics with her. They did not ask Vex to explain Krell biology beyond what Dr. Chen asked directly. And what Chen asked directly was specific and practical, and sometimes surprising. "The secondary circulatory system," Chen said, not looking up from Reth's arm. "It runs parallel to the primary, right? Lower pressure." "Yes," Vex said. "Good. That's what I thought. That's why he's still here." She loaded something into the injector. His primary circulatory system took damage from the infection, but his secondary compensated. Your species has better redundancy than the files give you credit for. Reth was looking at the ceiling with slightly more presence than he had managed in 3 days. His 4 eyes tracked Chen's movements with an expression that Vex identified as a combination of relief and extreme discomfort with being touched by an unfamiliar species, which was reasonable and also was simply going to have to be managed. "Am I going to be functional?" he asked, in a voice that was thin but more fully present than it had been. "You're going to be fine," Chen said. The word fine carried the flat authority of someone who had decided it was true and was not interested in negotiating the point. Reth looked at Vex. Vex looked at Reth. "She seems confident," Vex said. "She is confident," Chen said, still not looking up. "There's a difference." Lieutenant Dax had taken a portable scanner and walked the length of the ship, what remained of the habitable sections with the unhurried attention of someone reading a document in a language they were fluent in. He talked while he walked, not to Vex specifically, though she followed him for a section because it was her ship and she felt the need to accompany the assessment. He talked in the way of someone whose thinking process was partially external, the words coming out as they formed rather than after they had been arranged. "Here's what I don't understand," he said, ducking under a bent conduit in the corridor outside Deck 3. "The Varric hit your engine core first. Standard disabling shot. But then, he pointed at a section of wall where the plating had buckled inward from external impact. This angle, this strike came from below the ship, not from the side. They repositioned mid-end engagement. Vex looked at the buckled plating. They were thorough. They were systematic. He scanned the next section. There's a difference. Thorough means you keep hitting until you're satisfied. Systematic means you have a specific sequence and you follow it. They knew which systems to take in which order. He looked at her. They've hit a Krell survey vessel before. She had not thought of it in those terms. She thought of it now. Or they were given the schematics, she said. Dax pointed at her. That's the other option. Yeah. He moved on. The spy theory. You read our situation report. The captain briefed us before we came across. 12 seconds. She briefs fast. He stopped at the sealed door of what had been Deck 7. The door was holding a vacuum on the other side, which was why it was sealed, which was where 103 members of the crew were. He looked at the door for a moment with an expression that was not neutral, but also was not the kind of expression that required acknowledgement. Then he moved on. Vex moved with him. Vex. How many survey vessels does the collective have operating in this sector? He asked. 7 active missions in the third arm. The Krellora was the furthest out. 7, he said quietly to himself in a way that meant he was adding it to something. Okay. She wanted to ask him what the number meant in the context he was building it into. She did not ask because she was fairly certain the answer would not be immediately useful and would probably be unsettling, and she was managing her unsettlement intake carefully. They went back to the bridge. Commander Joro and Captain Marsh were sitting on opposite sides of the communications console, which no one had officially designated as a meeting point, but which had become one in the organic way that locations became things when the people with authority gravitated toward them. Joro was sitting upright. The pain medication from Dr. Chen's kit was doing something for him. Vex could tell because the controlled quality of his breathing had eased slightly. Less management and more rest. He still looked like a man who had spent 9 days sitting on the floor of a burning building, but he looked like one who had at least been handed a glass of water. Marsh sat across from him with her forearms on her knees, leaning forward, not in the way of someone asserting presence, but in the way of someone listening closely. They had been talking for some time. Vex settled near the viewport and did not interrupt. The collective will want to know why a human vessel responded to the signal before any compact member did. Jeroic was saying the compact relay in this sector has been running at reduced capacity for 8 months. Marsh said, Your signal probably reached it on day 2. It may have been logged as low priority pending confirmation of origin. Jeroic was quiet for a moment. Low priority. There's paperwork, Marsh said. And there was something in how she said it that was not quite anger and not quite contempt, but lived in the territory between them. There's always paperwork. And you had no paperwork. I had a distress signal and a course heading. She turned her hands up briefly, a human gesture. Vex noted. The translation of gestures across species was unreliable, but this one seemed to mean something like, "What else would you need?" The third arm is listed as a cooperative survey zone under the Compact Charter. That makes it my sector, too. Yorick looked at her for a long moment. You could have passed the signal to a Compact member vessel and continued your own mission. Yes, but you did not. No. Another pause. Why? Yorick asked. It was the same question Vex had been turning over since the first moment the Relentless had appeared. She found she wanted to hear the answer, not because she expected a tactical or political explanation. She had already worked out that neither of those applied here, but because the answer to why was the part the files had never fully covered. Marsh looked at the floor for a second in the particular way of someone choosing words from a larger collection than they intended to share. Because there were people on the signal, she said, and people on a signal 9 days out in the third arm are people who have run out of other options. She paused. We don't need a reason past that. Yorick was quiet. Then he said, the Veth War. Marsh glanced up. I read the file. Yorick said when I was a junior officer 30 years ago, the projection was 2 months. The Veth were larger, better equipped, and had held that territory for centuries. His eyes were steady on hers. No rational assessment of probability supported your outcome. No, Marsh agreed. But you won. We did. The file offered several theories. Yorick said logistical failures on the Veth side, communication breakdowns, terrain advantages in certain sectors, a pause. None of them fully accounted for the outcome. No, Marsh said they wouldn't. What accounts for it? Marsh looked at the viewport. The stars moved slowly past it as the Kelsara continued its long, lazy drift. She watched them for a moment with an expression that Vex could not read with any precision, but that had something in it that was very old and also very clear. The Veth believed we would stop when it hurt enough. She said they had a model. Every species they had ever fought had a point where the cost calculation tipped over and they quit. They were patient. They were very good at finding that point and pushing until they hit it. She turned back to Yorick. We don't have that point. The bridge was quiet. Not that you're incapable of stopping, Yorick said slowly. Not that we stop all the time when we choose to. She said it plainly without drama. The difference is that we choose. It doesn't get chosen for us by math. Vex turned this over. Engineer Talos appeared in the bridge entrance. He had spent the last hour with Kowalski, the human engineer, working on the power coupling stabilization, and something about the experience had left him with an expression that mixed professional respect with faint bewilderment. The coupling will hold for 7 hours, he said. Kowalski found a redundancy in the secondary system I had missed. Is this surprising? Vex asked. Talos considered the question honestly. Yes, it's a common system, Kowalski said from somewhere down the corridor. His voice drifted in through the open bridge door with the unconcerned ease of someone not bothering to step into a room to have a conversation. I fixed it about 40 times. Talos looked at the door on different ships. On this ship, it breaks about once a month. Talos absorbed this, and you have not replaced the component. We have 4 times a pause. We order a new one, it breaks. We patch the old one, it holds. At this point, Kowalski's law says, just patch the thing. Kowalski's law, Talos repeated as though verifying it, was a real thing. I named it myself. Very official. Vex watched Talos process this exchange with the focused attention of someone encountering a logic system they had not previously modeled. She understood the feeling. She was about to say something when Dax walked back onto the bridge with his scanner in his hand, and his expression 3D more serious than it had been 20 minutes ago. He looked at Marsh. Marsh looked at him. The look they exchanged lasted approximately 1 second, and in that 1 second, more information passed between them than Vex had managed to extract from 9 days of sensor readings. How long? Marsh said long-range passive picked them up 6 minutes ago. I wanted to verify before I brought it up. He turned the scanner so the screen faced the bridge. 3 contacts. The engine signatures were clear enough even on passive long range to remove any question about their origin. They're on an inbound vector moving at 3-4 thrust. Not full speed, not casual either. Comfortable like they already know nothing out here is going to give them a problem. He paused. Estimated arrival 5 hours 40 minutes. Ver raiders, 3 ships. V stood very still. She was aware in the back of her mind of the math she had spent 9 days carefully not finishing. She was aware of Wrath in the corridor and Sorvik on his cot, and 11 other people who had survived 11 minutes of systematic destruction and 9 days of silence. She was aware of the Kelsura around her. 20 hours of primary air capacity, non-functional engines, a frame that was bending degree by degree toward a point of no return. 3 Varric warships, 1 human vessel. Marsh stood up from the console. She looked at the scan data for a measured moment. Then she looked at Jorik, then at Dax. Her expression did not change in any way that Vex could clearly identify. She was not afraid. Vex had seen people who were not afraid because they had not yet understood the situation. She had also seen people who were not afraid because they had decided fear was not a useful tool right now and had put it somewhere else for later. She had very rarely seen people who were simply not afraid of the way. Some surfaces are simply not wet constitutionally at the base level. She was not entirely sure which category Marsh belonged to. She was not entirely sure the categories covered it. "All right," Marsh said. She said it the way you said a word that was beginning and not ending the way you said. "Okay, here we go. Dax, I want full weapons active in 10 minutes. Shields on standby. Get Rodriguez on the rail systems." "Already going," Dax said, and was gone. "Kowalski," Marsh said into her earpiece. "Stop whatever you're doing on the coupling and get back to the ship. We arrived in under 6 hours." A pause on the earpiece. Then Kowalski's voice. "How many?" "3. Another pause. "I'll just finish the coupling," he said. 10 more minutes. 8. 8. He agreed. Marsh turned to Vex. "How many of your people are mobile right now?" 9 with minimal assistance. 2 more with full support. Reth and Sorvik. They cannot be moved quickly. Marsh nodded. "I want everyone who can move across to the Relentless in the next 90 minutes. That gives us 4 hours before they arrive to settle your critical cases. Get your commander to medical and be in a position to receive whatever comes." "And the Krelsora?" Vex asked. Marsh looked at the bridge, the damaged walls, the dark screens, the viewport with the stars drifting through it, slow and patient, and completely indifferent. "She held you for 9 days," she said. "She did her job." A pause. "We'll do ours." Vex looked at the ship around her. Her ship, the one she had served on for 6 years, the one that had carried 209 people into the Third Arm and brought 14 of them back, and felt something move through her that she did not try to name. She turned to Commander Jorik. He was already looking at her. His expression said everything that needed to be said, which was also very little, because some moments were only large enough for what they were. "Let's go," he said. And behind them, through the bridge door, Vex could hear the Relentless crew already moving fast, certain, completely at home in a situation that had no good options, and the sound of it was improbably the most reassuring thing she had heard in 9 days. The Varric fleet dropped out of FTL at 4 hours and 52 minutes, 8 minutes early. Vex registered this from the observer position Marsh had given her on the Relentless bridge, a seat at the secondary sensor console, positioned so she could read the data without being in the way of the crew. It was a practical arrangement. She had been sitting there for 3 hours and 40 minutes watching the crew run pre-engagement checks, listening to the terminology, building a real-time vocabulary of how a human warship prepared for a fight. The short answer was loudly, and with a great deal of movement. The long answer was more complicated, and she was still working on it. 3 contacts on the main screen. Ver heavy assault class, each approximately 310 Delane, better armed than the Relentless on a per-ship basis and operating as a coordinated unit, which multiplied the disadvantage considerably. They came out of FTL in a triangular spread formation. Experienced, deliberate. The spread was designed so that any target returning fire would expose itself to the other two ships, no matter which direction it turned. Vex had studied enough tactical history to recognize the formation. She had also studied enough tactical history to understand what it meant when a force deployed it against a single opponent. It meant they did not expect a long engagement. It meant they were not planning for a difficult outcome. It meant they considered the outcome already calculated and were simply arriving to confirm the math. 3 of them, Tor said from navigation. Her voice was steady, which Vex suspected was partly training and partly the infectious quality of Marsh's absolute refusal to project anything that resembled alarm. 3, Marsh said without any particular inflection. Dax rolled his shoulders at the weapons console. I've had worse odds. When Tors asked, I'll think of something. He began running the targeting calibration with his fingers moving across the keys in a fast, light pattern, like someone playing an instrument they had learned young. Rodriguez, I want the rail systems on the lead ship first pass. Port and starboard both. Don't wait for my call. Just fire on acquisition. Rodriguez's voice came through the deck.com. Rail systems are warm. Acquisition set. Good. Dax looked at the screen. Here we go. The Varric lead ship opened a hailing channel. The voice that came through was the particular kind of calm that came from certainty. Not the controlled calm of someone managing difficulty, but the deep, unworried calm of someone who did not expect difficulty. The translation came through in flat, compact standard, but the register was clear enough. Vex had heard the vet speak before in trade contexts and at compact summits. She knew the register. This was the register they used when they already knew how something ended. Human vessel, you are in unregistered space operating outside your charter zone and in the presence of a verdict enforcement action. Stand down your weapons. Hand over the Krell survivors. Leave this sector and do not return. You have 3 minutes to comply. This offer will not be repeated. The bridge was quiet. Marsh looked at the hailing channel indicator on her armrest console. She looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone reading a document that had said something they found genuinely interesting. Then she pressed the response channel. This is Captain Sarah Marsh of the United States humanity ship Relentless. I've got 14 Krell citizens aboard this vessel who needed help and got it. They're not going anywhere with you. A pause, very short. As for your offer, I'm going to decline. She closed the channel. 1 second. 2. The Verl ship fired. The first impact hit the Relentless on the port forward shield array, and the whole ship rang like something enormous had struck it with something larger. Vex grabbed the edge of her console. The lights went amber. 6 alert indicators lit up across the bridge boards, and the sound they made was not the calm, measured tone of a ship monitoring a situation, but the sharper sound of a ship that had just been hit. Port shields at 72%. Tours called out. Hull integrity holding. Rodriguez, fire. Dax said it the way you said a word you had been waiting to say. The Relentless shook differently this time. Not the impact shake of taking a hit, but the deep structural vibration of its own weapons discharging. The rail systems were not the ship's largest weapons, but they were the fastest cycling, and the sound of them was a hard, rapid percussion that Vex felt in her lower thorax, rather than heard with her upper hearing organs. On the screen, the Varric lead ship's forward section took 2 impacts in 4 seconds. Not catastrophic, not close, but not nothing either. They're recalibrating shields, Dax said, reading his screen. Smart. They've got good reactive systems. Tours. Already moving, Tors said, and the Relentless movement. Not a smooth turn, but a hard-angled burn that pushed everyone against their seats and sent the star field on the main screen swinging through 60 degrees in about 3 seconds. Vex held the console with both upper limbs and made a mental note that human inertial compensation was adequate, but the operating tolerance was different from Krell standard. What they considered acceptable G-force on a combat maneuver was higher than anything the Krell Sora had ever done deliberately. The second Varric ship fired from the right. The impact hit the starboard aft section, and the lights dropped to red for 2 seconds before the backup systems caught and brought them back to amber. Something on the deck below the bridge made a sound like structural protest. "Starboard aft shield array is down." Tor said, "Hull breach on deck 11. Emergency bulkhead sealed." "Is deck 11 occupied?" Marsh asked. "No. Then we're fine." Dax was already firing. The Relentless had heavier weapons, the forward lances, charged particle systems that cycled slower than the railguns, but carried significantly more energy per shot. The first lance discharge lit up the main screen in a hard white line and hit the second Varric ship directly amidships. Not a glancing shot, not deflected, a full impact on the primary hull section. The second Varric ship's running lights went out for 4 seconds, then came back, then went through irregular damage. Marsh said their main power coupling took it. Dax said they're running on backup, speed reduced by, he checked, about 40%, maybe more. They're going to take a few minutes to sort themselves out. Then ignore them for now. Focus 2 through 4 on the first ship. On it, Vex watched the first Varric ship on the screen and tried to process what she was observing in the context of everything she knew about space combat, which was mostly theoretical. The Varric were not retreating. They had expected this engagement to last 3 minutes. This was clear from their formation, from the speed of their advance, from the confidence in their opening hail. They had expected the Relentless to calculate the odds and reach the obvious conclusion. The Relentlessness was not calculating the odds. Or perhaps it was, and had simply reached a different conclusion. The third Varric ship came around the left side on an attack vector aimed at the Relentless's exposed starboard flank, the one without the shield array. And Vex opened her mouth to say something because from her console she could see the angle, and the angle was not good. Marsh had already turned to Tor's. "Flip us now." Flipping the Relentless roll. Not a gentle bank, a full axial roll 180 degrees in about 2 seconds, which flipped the intact shield array into the path of the incoming fire and exposed the aft hull section, which had more armor than the starboard midsection, which was apparently a calculation Torres had made without being asked, because she had already adjusted the thrust burn to compensate for the new orientation by the time the roll completed. The third ship shot hit the shield. The shield held 61% of the port array and is still functional. Good. Keep rolling. I want us to present a moving target, not a fixed one. The Relentlessness kept rolling slowly, a long continuous rotation that made the star field on the main screen turn in a lazy circle. Vex watched the Varric ships on the tactical display instead of the main screen, because the main screen was currently disorienting in ways she did not need. "Here's the thing about the triangle formation," Dax said, talking while he worked, firing between sentences with the ease of someone accustomed to multitasking under conditions that should not permit it. "It's great if the target holds position. If the target doesn't hold position, the 3 ships end up shooting around each other." He fired. Lance discharge. The lead ship shield array took the hit, and the screen showed the cascade failure starting along the left side of their defensive envelope there. Cascade on ship 1, toss nose 30-degree left. 30 left. Firing. The lead ship's left shield collapsed. The Relentless fired 3 rail shots in half a second into the exposed hull section while the shields were down. Fast, precise. The kind of precision that came from Dax's hands, knowing where the keys were in the dark. From a calibration process, he had clearly run enough times that it was not a process anymore, but a reflex. The lead ship went dark. Not destroyed, not immediately, but all propulsion cut out simultaneously, and the ship drifted and turned slowly on its own momentum, like something that had stopped deciding to move. Disabled one. The second ship was still dealing with the power coupling damage. Its weapons were firing, but the accuracy had suffered. 2 shots went wide. A third clipped the Relentless's forward hull and shook the bridge, but clipping was different from hitting, and the damage report that Tors called out was manageable. "Deck 9 is complaining," Tors said. "Minor hull stress. No breach." "Tell Deck 9 to manage," Marsh said. Vex did not ask who on Deck 9 she expected to receive this message. The third ship had realized something. Vex could see it in the tactical data. The third Var ship had adjusted its speed and heading, not an attack adjustment, a positioning adjustment. It was moving to a different part of the tactical space, a part that was further from the Relentless, and also further from the other two ships, as if it had decided to remove itself from a specific proximity. Ship 3 is pulling back. Tor said. I see it, Marsh said. Are they retreating? Marsh watched the movement on the screen for a second. No, they're thinking. Thinking about what? Thinking that this is not what they planned for. She did not sound satisfied by this. She sounded like someone watching a variable shift and accounting for it, which means they're going to try something else. Dax, can we get the second ship before they figure out what it is? Working on it. He was already running new targets. The second ship had restored partial power, but partial power was not full power, and the accuracy of their return fire confirmed it. Their weapons lock is slow. If Tors gives me a steady 3-second window. I can give you 2, Tors said. 2 works. Tors gave him 2 seconds of straight heading, and Dax put a full lance discharge directly into the second ship's main weapons bank. The explosion on the screen was significant, not a destruction. The ship was still there, still powered, still present, but the weapons bank was gone. And a ship without weapons in the middle of a fight was a ship that had only one remaining function, which was to leave. The second ship left. It did not do it gracefully. It did it in the way of something that has calculated fast and reached an unpleasant conclusion and decided the conclusion was actionable. Full thrust away vector heading out of the engagement zone and not stopping. 2 down. The third ship was still there, still thinking. Here it is, Dax said quietly. The third ship opened a hailing channel. This time the voice was different. Not the first speaker, a different rank, a different register. And the register was not the deep certain calm of a force that had already won. It was something Vex had not heard from a Varric speaker before, in any context. It was a careful human vessel. This engagement has exceeded standard parameters. We request a cessation discussion, which was the way the Varric said they wanted to stop. The bridge was quiet. Marsh looked at the screen, the disabled lead ship drifting, the retreating second ship getting smaller, the third ship sitting at extended range and waiting. She pressed the response channel. You attacked a survey vessel and killed 209 people, she said. You left 14 survivors to die in a wreck. You came back to finish the job. A pause. There is no cessation discussion. She closed the channel. Then she looked at Dax. Finish it, she said. What happened next was not clean. Nothing about the third Varric ship's end was clean. It tried to run, and the Relentless was faster. It tried to return fire, and the return fire found nothing but rolling shields, and answered back with everything the Relentless carried in its forward lance arrays. Fired in a sequence that Dax ran like a man who had been waiting his entire career for precisely this firing solution. It took 4 minutes. Then the third Varric ship was a debris field, and the Relentless was the only thing with running lights in this part of the third arm, and the bridge was very quiet for a moment, except for the ship system cycling down from combat readiness and Tours reading out the damage report in a voice that remained steady all the way through. Shields at 38%. 2 minor hull breaches sealed by emergency systems. 1 weapons array offline. Deck 9, structural stress. Deck 11, breach already contained. No casualties, no casualties. Vex sat at her borrowed console and looked at her hands and realized she had been holding the edge of it hard enough that her grip had left stress marks in the composite material. She released it carefully. Commander Jorik was in medical condition. She had left him there an hour ago, and she was glad he had not been here for this, not because she thought it would have disturbed him, but because she thought the doctors would have had trouble keeping him in the bed. Marsh stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the tactical display for a long moment. The debris fielded where the third ship had been. The retreating second ship, now almost out of sensor range, and moving as though it intended to keep moving indefinitely. The dark, drifting wreck of the lead ship. Then she said, Tours get us a course back to the nearest compact relay point. Standard cruise speed. She looked at Dax. Damage assessment, full report, 1 hour. 1 hour, Dax said. He looked at his weapons console, then looked at the screen. We're going to need a new rail calibration after all that. Is that a problem? He picked up the calibration tool from the console beside him for about 20 minutes. Then start now. He started now. Vex looked at the viewport at the stars and the debris and the dark wreck of the Varric lead ship, slowly turning in the middle distance at the Krella, visible on the edge of sensor range, listing at its 19 degree. Crewless now finished. 209 people. The Varric had come back to make sure there was no one left to talk about what they had done here. They had been wrong about that. She turned to find Marsh standing beside her console, not having announced her approach, looking at the same viewport. How do you do that? Vex asked. Marsh glanced at her. Fight like that, Vex said. 3 ships, the calculations. We don't lead with the calculations, Marsh said simply without drama. We lead with the decision. The calculations come after. She turned from the viewport and walked back toward the center of the bridge, already pulling up the damage report on her armrest console. Already in the next problem, Vex turned back to the stars. The debris field caught the distant starlight the way wreckage always did. Scattered, drifting, quiet. Now space was very good at making large things look small after the fact. She thought about the relay station somewhere out there where her distress signal had been logged as low priority. She thought about the word pending. She thought about the relentless showing up instead. She turned back to her console and began writing her preliminary incident report. Not because anyone had asked her to, because a communications officer filed reports. And she was still a communications officer. And some things you held on to, not because they were useful, but because they were yours. They left Kelsura on the second day, not immediately, not without consideration. Commander Jorik had asked from the medical bay of the Relentless whether there was any possibility of a salvage claim, and the human engineer Kowalski had walked the wreck a final time with a scanner and come back shaking his head in the honest way of someone who respects the person enough to tell them the truth clearly. The frame is cracked in 2 places, and the 3rd hull breach opened further while we were fighting. He said, she's not going anywhere under her own power, and towing her at warp speed would finish what the crack started. He paused. She held together long enough. Joro had looked at the ceiling of the medical bay for a moment. Yes, he said. She did. Marsh had offered to scuttle the Kelsara cleanly, a full system discharge. No wreckage left for the Varric or anyone else to pick through for data cores or survey records. Jorik had accepted. The discharge was quick. Vex had watched it from the relentless viewport with her hands folded, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was proportionate to what she was watching. And she had learned in the last 10 days that the things that were too large for language were best met with silence rather than with words that couldn't carry the weight. The Kelsura went quietly, the way good ships deserve to go. The Relentless ran at 3/4 speed toward the nearest compact relay point, a journey of approximately 4 days at that pace. The reduced speed was a concession to the structural stress on Deck 9, not critical, Kowalski said, but worth treating carefully, and Marsh had made the concession without discussion, which Vex noted as a data point about how Marsh weighed speed against the safety of her crew. The calculation was not even close enough to require discussion. The 14 Krell survivors occupied a section of the crew quarters on Deck 6. The Relentless had room. It was built for a crew of 220 and Marsh ran it with 194, which left space that was used for equipment storage and emergency capacity. The crew had cleared a section in about 3 hours on the first day, not reluctantly, practically in the way this crew did most things. Vex had a cabin to herself, small by Krell standards, which meant approximately the right size by any reasonable standard. She slept in it for 6 hours on the first night, and woke up in the dark and lay still for a long time, listening to the Relentless around her, the deep, steady hum of its engines, the occasional distant sound of the crew on night rotation, the ship breathing the way, a healthy ship breath, even controlled, all systems running as designed. She had not heard a ship breathe like that in 10 days. She lay still and listened to it for a while before she got up. Reth was in the medical bay, which occupied a significant section of Deck 4, and was staffed around the clock by Dr. Chen and her 3 medics. The infection was responding to treatment. Not fast enough for Reth's comfort, which he expressed by asking Chen every 4 hours how much longer he would be there. And Chen expressed her answer by continuing to treat him at the same pace, regardless of the question. "She doesn't change anything when I ask," Rath said on the second day when Vex visited him. "No," Vex said. "I've asked 6 times." "I know." He looked at the ceiling. At least it's a different ceiling. Sorvek was recovering more slowly. The cranial pressure issue required careful management, constant monitoring, medication that Dr. Chen had synthesized from the Relentless's stores after reading the Krell medical files with the focus speed of someone who processed technical material the way other people processed food. Sorovich slept most of the time, which Chen said was correct and expected, and was itself a form of healing. His brain is doing the work. She said sleep is the work. "Is he going to be fully functional?" Vex asked. "Ask me again in a week." She said it not as a deflection, but as an accurate answer, the kind that meant, "I don't know yet, and I won't tell you I do, but I'm not worried." Which, for reference, is a meaningful statement. It was, Vex decided, a meaningful statement. On the 3rd day, Marsh found Vex at the secondary observation bay at the stern of the ship. The observation bay was a small room with a large curved viewport built for the purpose of looking at things which Vex had been using extensively, because looking at the stars from inside a ship that was not dying felt like something that required regular acknowledgement. The stars were the same stars. They had not changed. She was the one who had changed in relation to them, and sitting with that change seemed important. Marsh came in, looked at the viewport, and sat down in the second chair with the ease of someone who had been in this room many times. They sat in silence for a moment. "How are your people?" Marsh asked. "Better," Vex said. "Reth is recovering. The Sorv is stable. The others are," she considered the word, "adjusting." Adjusting. 10 days ago, there were 20 of us. She said it simply without inflection because inflection would have implied there was an appropriate emotional register for the sentence, and she did not know what that register was. Now there are 14. That is a large adjustment. The Marsh was quiet. "Do you lose people?" Vex asked. "Yes. Often more than any version of this job should require." She turned the question over before she answered it more fully. "Less than it used to. We've gotten better at some of the things that used to kill us, not all of them." A pause. "We still have the habit of going to places we probably shouldn't go." "The third arm," Vex said among others. Vex looked at the viewport, a star cluster in the far distance, dense and bright, catching the long attention of the ship's passage. "The files on your species describe it as a risk calculation failure." She said the behavioral tendency. They frame it as an evolutionary leftover, something that was useful when humans lived on one planet and is now, she paused for the right word, poorly calibrated for the actual threat environment. Marsh made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "What?" Vex said. "That's a very polite way to put it. What would be an impolite way that we're a species that was almost wiped out so many times on our own planet that the individuals who survived were the ones who couldn't stop fighting even when stopping was the smart call." She said it without self-pity. The way you recited a fact that was old enough to be just a fact. The vet thought that was a flaw, something to use against us. Waiting long enough hurt them badly enough and the calculation shifts. She turned to look at Vex. "The calculation doesn't shift. That's not a calculation. That's the floor." Vex processed this. "A floor," she said. "The lowest we go, where we stop falling." Marsh looked back at the viewport. "You can push us to it." The vet did. "Plenty of others have tried, but you can't push us through it." "Is that why you came?" Vex asked, "when you got the signal." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "I came because there were people who needed help." She said, "That's the whole answer. It doesn't have a more complicated version. The files suggest the files are trying to explain something with language that was built for different things. She said it without irritation, as a plain observation. You can't fully explain why a person runs into a burning building by talking about evolutionary psychology. The explanation is true and also completely misses the point. She turned to Vex. The point is that there were people in the building. Vex looked at her. You ran toward the building. Vex said that's what we do. Silence, clean, and full. The kind that did not need to be filled. Vex thought about it for 9 days. She thought about the distress signal going out 87 times and coming back with nothing 87 times. The silence was so consistent and complete that she had begun to mistake it for the universe's actual position on the matter. She thought about the small moment when the console had beeped with an incoming signal, and she had not let herself feel what she felt, because feeling it before she knew what it was would have been its own particular cruelty, and then it had been a human ship. And then, we're coming. Sit tight. I have a question. Vex said, Go ahead. When you heard the distress signal, before you knew who we were, what species, whether there was any political reason to respond? She paused. Was there a moment where you considered not going? Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she said, No. One word, flat and clean, and not offered as bravery the way some species would have offered it, just as a fact about the decision. The decision had not contained that option. Vex turned back to the stars. She thought about the compact relay station that had logged the signal as low priority. She thought about the 16 space-faring species in the standard registry, none of whom had come. She thought about the human ship that operated outside the standard registry, the one that had arrived. Anyway, she said after a while, is very strange. I know, Marsh said. The files don't cover it adequately. They never do. A brief pause. Though I appreciate the effort. Vex looked at her. The expression on Marsh's face was one she had been slowly learning to read over the past 3 days. It was a very dry expression. It lived at the border between serious and not serious, and it crossed back and forth across that border so quickly that the only way to track it was to stop trying and simply accept the ambiguity. Thank you, Vex said. Marsh turned to look at her. For the signal response, Vex said. For the boarding team. For Dr. Chen. For the battle. She thought about the words and found them insufficient and said them anyway because insufficient words were better than silence in this particular moment for coming. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Don't thank me, she said. File a complaint with the compact about their relay station. Then she stood up and left. Vex sat with the viewport and the stars for a long time after that. They reached the compact relay point on the 4th day. A Krell collective response vessel was already waiting. The relay station had transmitted as soon as the Relentless checked in, and the collective moved fast when it had a target to move toward, which it now did. The response vessel was larger than the Relentless, and arrived with the specific energy of an organization that had spent 10 days dealing with the political and logistical dimensions of losing a survey ship, and was now confronting the human and emotional dimensions of finding out some of the crew were alive. The transfer took 2 hours. Jeroic walked across the docking corridor under his own power, which the Krell response vessel's medical team tried to prevent, and he declined to be prevented from. He paused at the midpoint of the corridor, the point where the Relentless's deck plating ended and the Krell vessels began and turned back. Marsh was standing at the docking entrance. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his right upper limb across his chest. A Krell gesture, old formal, from a register of the culture that was rarely used in modern contexts. The gesture meant, I acknowledge a debt that has no transaction. Marsh put her right hand flat against her own chest, a human gesture that Vex did not recognize the formal origin of. But she recognized it the way you recognized anything that communicated clearly across a gap. It had no technical reason to cross. Jeroic turned and walked onto the Krell ship. Vex was the last one across. She stood at the docking entrance of the Relentless with her report already filed, preliminary incident documentation submitted to the Collective Intelligence Office on the relay station 3 hours ago, containing everything she had observed, calculated and concluded in the past 10 days. The full account of the attack, The 9 days of silence, the human ship, what it had done, what humans were, or the closest she could get to that in the format of an official report, which was a format that was very good at carrying facts and less good at carrying the texture of things. She looked at the relentless crew working around her, finishing the docking procedures, moving with their characteristic directness, talking at the volume of people who had decided a long time ago that life was shorter than it looked, and there was no reason to be quiet about it. Dax was recalibrating the rail system. He had been recalibrating it on and off for 2 days. He did it in the manner of a person who was mildly annoyed at a piece of equipment. He also clearly liked the way you were annoyed at something you trusted. Torres was running the post-transit navigation checks, calling out numbers in the crisp, steady voice that Vex had come to associate with her specifically. Dr. Chen was in the medical bay, which she had apparently not left except to sleep, continuing to run diagnostics on patients she had already stabilized, because stabilization was not the same as done. Kowalski was somewhere in the lower decks talking to a power coupling, and Marsh was standing at the far end of the docking corridor with a data pad in her hand, and 3 separate crew members trying to get her attention at the same time. And she was answering all 3 of them in the unhurried, sequential way of someone who had no intention of being rushed and no need to announce this fact. Vex looked at all of it. She turned to Marsh, who had noticed her still standing at the entrance. Marsh noticed most things and gave a brief nod across the distance. Vex returned it. Then she crossed the threshold onto the Krell ship. The incident report was entered into the collective's official record 4 days after Vex returned home. It was flagged by the intelligence office, then by the diplomatic office, then by the office of the Admiral Commander, who read it twice and forwarded it to 3 other officers with a personal annotation that Vex was never shown, but heard about later in the particular way that official annotations sometimes became unofficially known. The annotation reportedly said, "Read this carefully. Then read the part about what they did when 3 warships showed up. Then tell me what our relay response policy says about pending signals from the third arm." The relay response policy was revised within 6 months. The Veric raiders did not return to the third arm survey zone. Not that month, not that year, not in the years that followed. The Collective Intelligence Service ran analysis on vertical movement patterns in the region, and the conclusion was straightforward. The raiders had revised their operating assumptions following the engagement. The third arm was now a zone where human vessels operated and responded, and did not perform the retreat calculation that should by every reasonable model have concluded the engagement before it began. The Vedic were pragmatic. Pragmatic entities updated their models among the spacefaring community. The incident generated the particular kind of attention that quiet things sometimes generated. Not the loud attention of a battle covered by relay broadcasts, but the careful private attention of intelligence officers and tactical analysts and species representatives at compact summits, who read Vex's report and discussed it in the measured language of people who were recalibrating their models. What none of the reports captured, and what Vex was aware none of them would capture, was the weight of the console beeping on the 9th day. The specific quality of those 4 seconds of silence, after she had transmitted the silence before Marsh's voice came through. The texture of the words were coming. Sit tight. How small and complete and entirely sufficient they were. She wrote a final page to her personal record, not the official report which was already filed. A private document that was not for the collective or the intelligence office or the diplomatic office or any of the offices that would revise their policies and update their models in the aftermath. She wrote it for herself because some things needed to be said somewhere, even if only for the record that no one else would read. The signal went unanswered for 9 days. She wrote, "The universe is very large and largely indifferent, and 9 days of silence is enough to learn this in a way that no theoretical study covers." On the 10th day, a human ship responded. The files on human behavior describe a species with poor risk calibration, high aggression thresholds, and an anomalous relationship to the survival calculation. The files are accurate on all of these points, and wrong about what they mean. What they mean is this. When the signal went out, the human ship came. Not after a committee discussion, not after a policy review, not after a calculation that weighed the risk against the return. Just we heard you. We're coming. I do not fully understand humans. I am no longer certain the files are the right tool for it. What I know is that there were 14 of us, and the ship that came had 219 people aboard, and not one of them hesitated. That is the complete and total record of what I observed. It is enough.